Masechet Cholin Daf Nun Zayin 57, the Mishnah said, Nishtaberu ragleha. If the legs of a bird are broken, the bird is still kosher. Hahu sana de in kore de atya lekame de rava, badke rava besomet hagidin ve'achshere. Here's a story about a basket full of birds that had broken legs, and it was brought before Rava to examine them, and the broken legs were not a problem, but he did inspect each bird at the convergence of sinews in the thigh, and he wanted to make sure that the sinews were still intact, and he found that they were intact, and he said it is kosher. In other words, even though a broken bone is not a problem, but you still have to make sure that this convergence of sinews is intact. So this is where it is on the bird, the convergence. Here's a picture of it. You can see here the bone that we call the drumstick, and so if that's broken, it's still kosher. But these sinews here, there's many sinews that converge all in one spot over here, and those have to still be intact in order for it to be kosher, according to Rava. Amar Rav Yuda Amar Rav, Shimutat Yad Bibhema Keshera, Shimutat Yarech Bibhema Terefa. Rav gives a ruling that a dislocated foreleg in an animal is kosher, but a dislocated femur is a terefa. Here is a picture of those. So the foreleg is over here, if that's dislocated. So dislocated is a little different from broken, it's worse. Dislocated means that it's basically completely detached. It's almost as if it's amputated. And so if the foreleg is dislocated, that's still okay, still kosher. But the hind leg of an animal over here, if that is dislocated, it is a terefa. Rav continues his ruling regarding a bird and teaches, Shimutat yarech be'of terefa, Shimutat gaf be'of terefa. A dislocated femur in a bird makes it terefa, and also a dislocated wing in a bird makes it terefa. So a bird is actually more stringent than an animal. When it comes to an animal, the back is serious, but the front dislocation is okay. But here's the equivalent in a bird. The leg of a bird, it only has one set of legs, is equivalent to the hind leg, and so that, just like the same as the animal, if its leg is dislocated, then it's terefa. But for a bird, also, if the wing, which is the same as an equivalent of a foreleg in an animal, if this is dislocated, also it is a terefa. Why is a bird more stringent? Because we are worried that if the wing is dislocated, then there could be also a perforation in the lung because they're so close together. You can see in this picture, here is a bird's lung, and the ribs over here are grooved, and in other words, the bones of the bird are right next to the lung, and so if the wing bone is dislocated, that may damage the lungs, and that's why Rav says we have to be more stringent in a bird. Ushmuel amar tibadek, v'chen amar Rabbi Yochanan tibadek. However, Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan are a little bit more lenient, and they say that if the wing of a bird is broken, is rather dislocated, then it's not automatically a terefa, as Rav says, but rather it just means that you have to check. You have to inspect the lung by blowing the lung up and seeing if any air escapes. You blow into it, and if nothing escapes, then that means the lung is intact. But you do have to check because there's a reason to suspect that it may be perforated since the wing has been dislocated. And now an interesting challenge, a question of anatomy, of bird anatomy. Chizkiah says that a bird does not have lungs. Rabbi Yochanan says it does have lungs. And Rabbi Yochanan describes it, that the lungs look like a rose petal. They're thin and red, and they are between its wings. So now we ask, when Chizkiah says that there's no lung, what does he mean? There is a lung, you can see it. If he means that it actually does not have a lung at all, but that's not true. You open it up and you can see the lung. Rather, maybe Chizkiah means that it does not become terefa by having a perforation in the lung. That's what it means. And le'of, there's no law that it will be terefa if there's a problem with the lungs. Is that what he means? V'hatane levi terefot shemenu chachamim bebehema kenegdan ba'of yater lehen of shenishbar ha'etzim af al pi shelo nikab kerum shel moach. But that can't be what he means, because Levi taught a baraita that taught that any sign of a terefa that the sages listed that applied to an animal also applied to a bird. And this is one of them. A perforated lung for an animal is a terefa, and that has to be true also for a bird. The Braita continues and says that there's another sign of terefa for a bird that does not apply to an animal, and that is if the skull is broken, even if the membrane of the brain was not perforated. When it comes to a bird, that will still be a terefa. However, that's not true for an animal. We mentioned that yesterday. It's talking about a water bird. Anyway, we cannot say that Chizkiah meant that there's no terefa laws regarding the lung, because the Braita says that there is a terefa law for a bird lung also. Rather, maybe Chizkiah means that the bird's lung does not have a problem of falling and singeing. If the bird falls and lands on something, bangs itself, or it gets singed, then you don't have to worry that the lungs are damaged thereby. And Rav Chana explains the reason is because the majority of the bird's ribs protect the lungs, because as we saw in the picture here, the ribs are all around the lungs, so they're protected, and it will not be damaged by a fall or by fire. Is that what he means? No, that explanation of Chizkiah also doesn't make sense, because compare it with the words of Rabbi Yochanan. He said birds do have lungs, and he describes their physical appearance. They look like rose petals, and they're between the wings. Since he's describing their color and exactly where they are, so that means Chizkiah disagrees with that and thinks, no, they're not there. They don't have that color, and they're not between the wings. They physically don't have lungs at all. That is what he means. Rather, in Eretz Yisrael, they said in the name of Rabbi Yosef, son of Rabbi Hanina, that the statement of the distinguished one, Chizkiah, we're giving him honor. He is a great sage. However, from his statement that says that birds do not have lungs, it is apparent that he is not familiar with chickens. He didn't deal with chickens too much, and he's not familiar. And the basic chicken anatomy, bird anatomy, is that birds do have lungs. They do work differently, interestingly. They don't inhale and exhale, but rather as they fly, the air actually just goes through the lungs, because they need to process a lot of oxygen to keep to keep up the energy for flying. So it's true, their lungs are a little different, but they certainly do have lungs, and he simply was not familiar. Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav, Shemutat Yarech Be'of Keshera. And now we're going to analyze a couple of statements of Rav. Rav Huna says in the name of Rav that a dislocated femur in a bird, that's okay, it's kosher. Amar le Rabba ba Rav Huna le Rav Huna. V'harabanan da'atu mepupadita amru. Rav Yehuda mishmed Rav amar shmutat yarech be'of terefa. But Rabba bar Rav Huna told Rav Huna, who just reported that, he says that the sages that came from Pupadita quoted Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav. Rav had many students. One of them is Rav Huna, but another primary student is Rav Yehuda. And he, in Pupadita, quoted Rav as saying that a dislocated femur in a bird is terefa. Why'd you say it's kosher? Rav Huna answers, Amar le beri, nahara ufshate. My son, every river follows its course. It's interesting to apply this phrase here. This phrase applies many times throughout Shas, and generally it means every place has its own practice. In one city, they're machmir on something, and in another city, they're mekel on something. And that's okay. There's pluralism of practice. What's strange here is that we're applying it to the statement of Rav. What did Rav actually rule? What did he say? And there's different traditions about what he ruled, what he said. And so you have to say, each river follows its course, meaning each place has a different tradition about what Rav said. Either that means that the students, are not sure what he said, there's some miscommunication or misunderstanding of Rav, or perhaps Rav gave different rulings for each place. Rav recognized that when it comes to this place, the practice is different from that place, and so that would be a more appropriate, a more natural application of the each river follows its course to say that Rav himself perhaps ruled differently when he came to this city or that city, because he recognized that every city follows every river follows its own course. Every city has their own practices. Azal Rabbi Abba Ashkeche leRav Yirmiyah bar Abba dekabadik besomet hagidin. And now a story about Rabbi Abba. He saw that Rav Yirmiyah bar Abba was inspecting birds at the convergence of the sinews to see if it was okay. So apparently there was some problem. The leg was broken, but he wanted to make sure that the sinews were intact. Amar le, lama le lemor kulehai, v'ha Rav Huna amar Rav shemutat yarech be'of keshera. And Rabbi Abba said, Rav Yirmiyah, why are you doing that? Why are you checking the convergence of the sinews? Rav Huna said in the name of Rav that a dislocated femur is kosher. Dislocated, we're assuming right now, is basically the same as it being amputated. And so even if it's dislocated, and we assume that means also that the sinews are ripped, then it's kosher. So why are you checking the sinews? What do you have to check for? Even if they're broken, Rav would say that is still kosher. Amar le, ana matnitin yada ana behema shenichtechu ragleha minar kobal mata keshera minar kobal ma'la pesula vechen shenital somet hagidin v'amar Rav ala vechen be'of. And Rav Yirmiyah answered, listen, I don't know about this tradition that you're quoting in the name of Rav, but I do know my Mishnayot. And there's a Mishnah later in this Masechet that says, regarding an animal, that if an animal's leg was cut, if it's from the joint and below, it's okay. Meaning the end of the leg is cut off, that's okay. If it's from the joint and above, meaning the top of the leg is amputated, then it's pesula, it's terefa. And so also, if the convergence of the sinews was removed. And then Rav said about that, that's true not only for an animal, but also for a bird. So we see that for a bird, if it's amputated or if the sinews are removed, are broken, then it's not kosher. So Rav clearly said that this applies to a bird, and I'm following that. I don't know about this tradition that you said in the name of Rav, so that's why I'm checking the sinews. And Rabbi Abba said back, Yachi kasha derav aderav ishtik. Rabbi Abba says, well, apparently we have a contradiction between two statements of Rav. Rav Huna, in the name of Rav, said that a dislocated leg in a femur in a bird is kosher, but then I've also said that the laws of an animal apply to a bird, and this is talking about a leg that is amputated and also the convergence of the sinews that's removed, then it's no good. So we have a contradiction between two statements of Rav. What should we do? And Rabbi Yirmiyah was silent. He did not have an answer to this. But Rabbi Abba thought of one. Amar le, Dilma shani la ben shemuta la hatucha. Maybe Rav makes a distinction between dislocated and amputated. If it's only dislocated, that's what Rav Huna was talking about. Dislocated, it still could live with a dislocated femur, and therefore it's kosher. But if it's cut, then that's much worse, and therefore that would be a terefa. And so if it's actually cut, then you do have to check the sinews, and that's what Rav Yirmiyah was doing. Amar le ve'at mefarshat shema'atate de Rav beferush amar Rav. And Rav Yirmiyah said, oh, are you trying to come up with an explanation for Rav? You don't need to. Rav said this explicitly. Apparently when Rav Yirmiyah was quiet over here, not because he didn't know the answer, but rather because the answer was obvious to him. Because Rav taught, Shemuta keshera chatucha pesula, v'al titma sherechotcha mikan umeta, chotcha mikan ve'haita. Rav taught that if the femur is dislocated, then it's still kosher. But if it's cut, then it's no good. And don't be wondrous about this, because these seem to be the same. Dislocated, I mean, it's like physically attached, but it's basically the same as cut. So why are you making a fine distinction between dislocated and amputated? No, don't be wondrous about this, because when it comes to animal anatomy, you can cut over here and it'll die, cut over there on that side and it'll live. It could be right near, the cuts can be right near each other. And if you cut on this side of a certain organ or limb, it will die. On that side, it'll be okay. It just depends on what you're cutting. And therefore, very fine distinctions. It could look similar, but still, one will be a terefa and one will be kosher. Ki selik Rabbi Abba ashkechel Rabbi Zera diati v'kamar amarav huna amarav shemutat yarech ba'of terefa. And now a story about Rabbi Abba when he traveled from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael. He found there Rabbi Zera, who was repeating that Rav Huna said in the name of Rav that if you have a dislocated femur in a bird, it's a terefa. This is somewhat surprising because we quoted Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav saying that the same thing is keshera, just a few lines up. So you see there was a lot of discussion and disagreement about what Rav said. So anyway, he has a tradition here. Rabbi Zera has a tradition from Bavel, because originally Rav Huna said this in Bavel, and Rabbi Zera himself traveled from Bavel and made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. And so he remembers that it was terefa. And then Rabbi Abba, he travels to Eretz Yisrael, and here's Rabbi Zera saying this. And Rabbi Abba is very surprised. Amar le haye demor, mi omad desilig mor lehacha, hava alan pitchon pe kame de Rav Huna, ush il ne ve'amar lan shemutat yarech be'of keshera. Rabbi Abba says, by the life of the Master, since the day that the Master came here to Eretz Yisrael, we spoke to Rav Huna many times. You left many years ago and came to Eretz Yisrael. We've been in Bavel, and we've been speaking to Rav Huna many times, and we've discussed this repeatedly. And we asked him about this very case, and he said that, according to Rav Huna reported that if you have a dislocated femur in a bird, it is kosher. And now Rabbi Abba's going to add to his argument, Vashkachte name Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, Deati vekabadik besomet hagidin. והקשילה, לה סבר לה אמור, דאמר רב הונא אמר רב, שמותת ירך בעוף כשרה. And now, Rabbi Abba is going to repeat the sugya that we just learned, and he's going to repeat it all to Rabbi Zera to further prove his point. And so now he's telling Rabbi Zera, just a while ago, I saw Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, and he was sitting and checking the convergence of the sinews in the thigh of a bird. And I asked him, why are you checking it? Doesn't the master agree with Rav Huna, who said in the name of Rav that a dislocated femur in a bird is kosher? So if it's kosher, why are you checking it? Amar li ana matnitin yadana behema shenichnechu ragleha min arkoba lemata keshera min arkoba lemala pesula v'chen shenital somet hagidin v'amar Rav ala v'chen be'of. And Rav Yirmiyah says, leave me alone. I know a Mishnah, and I know what I've said about this Mishnah, and I'm following that as the halacha. The Mishnah teaches that if you have an animal whose leg is amputated, if it's below a joint, it's okay, it's kosher. If it's above the joint, then it's pesula. And also, if the convergence of the sinews is removed, it's a terefa. And Rav says that's also true for a bird. And here, I have to check the sinews, because Rav taught that if the sinews are removed, then it's no good. And I, Rabbi Abba says, I said to Rav Yirmiyah, well, then we have a contradiction between two statements of Rav, because on the one hand he said over here that it's keshera, and then a seemingly similar case he said that it's not that it's terefa. Ishtik Rav Yirmiyah was quiet. Although he was quiet, I challenged him. I said, maybe there is a distinction between a bird, a femur that's dislocated and one that's severed. He says, you suspect suspect there is. You're trying to give an interpretation. Actually, this is true, not by speculation. Beferush amar Rav. Rav said this explicitly. Shemuta keshera hatucha pesula. If it's only dislocated, it's kosher. But if it's severed, then it's not kosher. And that's why I was checking it. In this case, it was severed, so I needed to check it. Now, all this he's repeating. Ve'at ma bidach. And Rabbi Abba said bizara. So about you, what do you have? What traditions do you have? Because you're repeating that Rav Huna said name of Rav says it's terefa. But I heard that Rav Huna said name of Rav that it's kishera, and I heard it from him repeatedly. And also look at this whole story where I discussed it with Rav Yirmiyah, and he agreed that one statement of Rav says it's kosher. He didn't say that's not a true tradition. He said that Rav makes a fine distinction between dislocated and cut. But he agrees with my version of Rav Huna in the name of Rav that dislocated is kosher. So what other traditions do you have about this that maybe can help shed some light on this? Hachi amar Rav Chia bar Ashe amar Rav, and he answered that I have a tradition of Rabbi Chia Rav Ashe in the name of Rav. So it's also in the name of Rav, but from a different student. Shimutat yarech be'of terefa. That Rav said is terefa. We saw above that already there are multiple traditions about what I've said. So here's another one that says terefa. V'chen amar Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi amar Rabbi Yochanan. Shemutat yarech be'of terefa. Also in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the greatest sage in Eretz Yisrael, said dislocated femur is terefa. V'amar Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi ilma lehava Rabbi Yochanan basra deoru ba chavravata lehetera la parkes. And regarding this, Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi said, if Rabbi Yochanan had been in the place in the assembly where the sages ruled to permit a bird, he would not have stirred. He would not have objected. And so, although Rabbi Yochanan said terefa, but if others ruled that it's permitted, he wasn't so strong about his stance. Because after Rabbi Chanina said the name of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, so now we're going up a generation, he said it's kosher. ומלאכה רבי חנינא והווה מורי בהלכה לתלמידים זה התיר לרבי, זה התיר לי רבי. And we have a fantastic story that Rabbi Hanina had a hen and its femur was dislocated and he brought this hen to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says it's permitted. And Rabbi Hanina said this is such an important chidush, he didn't eat that bird, instead he salted it. He salted it to preserve it, and then he would use it to teach his students. And he said, look over here, right? You see how this dislocated? I asked Rabbi and he permitted it to me. I asked him and he permitted it to me. It's repeated for emphasis. And so he would keep it for a demonstration so that the students could learn exactly what it is. So it's very strong. It's not just a theoretical halakha. Rabbi said it practically, and this was taught from that very hen to the future students. Okay, now we have a lot of statements here, but what's the final halakha? The final halakha is not with those statements, but rather it's going to follow this conversation that Rabbi Yosef ben Nehorai asked Rabbi Yosef ben Levi. Kedirat kaneh bechama. We're talking about a different topic now, but we're going to relate it back to the dislocated femur. If you have a windpipe that's punctured, how big does it have to be so for it to be a terefa? Amar lo mishnah shelema shaninu ad ke'isar haitalki. So what do you mean? Why are you asking that? We learned in the Mishnah that if the preparation is the size of an Italian isar or bigger, then it's terefa. Amar lo v'halo Rachel achat hayta b'shchunatenu shenikdar kaneh shela v'asu la kirumin shel kaneh ve'hayta. And Rabbi Yosef ben Nehorai says, but there's a story of a ewe in our neighborhood. Its windpipe had a puncture bigger than an Italian isad, and they made a seal for it out of a shell of a reed, and they were able to patch it up, and it lived. So you see that a hole is not necessarily a terefa. Even a big hole in the windpipe is not a terefa, because look, we were able to patch it up and it was able to live. So why are you saying that the halacha is that it should be a terefa? Amar lo ve'alda at samich. Well, you're relying on that story as evidence. You can't rely on evidence from the fact that one time they were able to patch it up and it was able to live a certain amount of time. That does not change the halacha. How do we know that that evidence does not change the halacha? From a parallel for our case. There's a widespread halacha that a dislocated femur is a terefa. Here is the bottom line. We saw all the statements over here of Rabbi and Rabbi Chanina. They all said it's kosher. But this is where the final halacha is going to follow this conversation, that a dislocated femur is in fact a terefa. And here's a story about it. Now one time there was a hen belonged to Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta, and its femur was dislocated, but they made a support, they made a little crutch for it, and it was able to live. So does that change the halacha? No, it does not change the halacha. Why doesn't it change the halacha? Didn't it live? Why are you calling it terefa? Well, yeah, maybe it lived for a short time. It lived from less than 12 months. Okay, less than 12 months. Still, it could be a terefa because it's not going to live more than 12 months. So too here with the punctured windpipe, although they were able to patch it up and it didn't die soon, but okay, it lives a few months, but that doesn't mean it's going to live more than 12 months, and therefore the fact that you're able to patch up a case here or there and it lived for some time does not change the bottom line halacha. The point is that through this conversation we see that the halacha rovachat, the widespread halacha, is that a dislocated femur is in fact a terefa. Amru alav al Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta she'askan bidvarim haya. It was said about Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta that he researched various matters, he was curious, he experimented in all kinds of different areas, as we will see. In one particular occasion, he did something to show that Rabbi Yehuda was incorrect. Rabbi Yehuda used to say that if a bird's down was removed, its feathers removed, it's a terefa. Now, Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta himself had such a bird whose down was removed. If he would ask Rabbi Yehuda, he would say that it's a terefa. But he wanted to prove that wrong, so he did an experiment. והניחה בתנור, ותלה עליה במטלית של תרסיים, וגידלה כנפיים האחרונים יותר מן הראשונים. And so he put this bird, a live bird, in an oven. It doesn't mean when the oven was very hot, just when it was warm. And he covered it in a leather apron that bronzers used, coppersmiths use, and that's has a lot of warmth. And so he was able to put it in this nice warm place for a while. And sure enough, its wings grew more feathers, even more than it had originally. Not only did it get restored to its original health, it actually got better than its original health. And that proves that Rabbi Yehuda's ruling is not correct. It's not correct that a feather whose that a bird whose feathers are removed is a terefa. It can get better. It can even get more healthy than it was before with a little care. So, therefore, it should be kosher. And now, you might ask, maybe Rabbi Yehuda thinks that even a terefa can temporarily get a little better. Well, this will be a discussion. And so, according to Rabbi Yehuda, even if there's such an injury that it can get a little better over some time, but then it's only going to be temporary and it's eventually going to get worse and it's going to die. So maybe Rabbi Yehuda thinks that, and that's why he thinks that, and that's what he would respond to Rabbi Shimon ben Halafta. Okay, fine, it got a little better, but it's only temporary, really it will die. אם כן, במידה דמתערפה בה, הגדילה כנפיים האחרונים יותר מן הראשונים. If so, it doesn't make sense that the very item that caused it to be a terefa, here, the feathers that came off, and that's where it should be, not only that it got restored to its health, but it got even better than it was before. It's one thing to say if there's some damage, and the damage gets 50% better. But then it'll drop off. Just because it got better temporarily doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to live for a long time. Temporarily better, a little better, and then it'll go off. But it doesn't. That's possible. Even if you say a terefa can get better temporarily, but for it to get even better than it was before, that shows that no, it's going to be healthier than it was before, and it's not a terefa. So that's one thing that Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta did. He liked to do experiments to check if certain things were true or not. Ma'askan bidvarim. Now, why did they call him someone who researches many things? Amar Rab Mishashia dichtib. Lech el nemala asel re'eh deracheha v'chacham, asher en la kasin shoter u'moshel, tachin bakayitz lachma. Rab Mishashia says that there's research that Rabbi Shimon did regarding ants. Pasuk says in Mishleh, go to the ant, you lazy person, look at her ways and be wise, which, having no chief, overseer, or ruler, provides her bread in the summer. You go look at ants, and they're very busy all summer preparing food, and there's no king, there's no master that's forcing them to do it. They're just not lazy. They like working, and we can learn a lesson from ants that to have a good work ethic. Amar ezil echze ivadaihu delet lehu malka. And Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta said, I want to see if this is true scientifically. He's a scientific researcher, and see if it's true that there's no king among the ants. Azal bitkufat Tammuz parseh leglimeh akina de shumshe maneh. So he went in Tammuz in the summer. It's very hot, and the ants don't want to come out of their hole because it's so hot. But he put his cloak over the ant hole, and then he made shade, so then it was cooler. Nefaka tahad minayu. Tanach be simana. One of the ants came out. He saw, oh, there's shade. It's nice out. And Rabbi Shimon put a mark on that ant. Brilliant, like scientists do today. So he knew which one it was. That ant went back into the hole. Al amar lehu nefal tula. And he said, oh, it's shady. Everybody can come out. He was the scout. Nefaku v'atu, so they all came out and they started working. Dalye liglime nefal shimsha naflu ale vekatle. So when all the other ants came out, Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta removed the cloak, and then it got sunny, and all the other ants got upset. So why'd you tell us it was shady and we all come out, now we're all hot? And they went and ganged up and killed that ant, the very one that he put a mark on. Amar shema'mina let lehu malka, di'it lehu harmana de malka la libau. Says, I can conclude from here that the ants do not have a king, because if there was a king, wouldn't they need a king's edict? They could just go kill anyone they want. Wouldn't they have to go back and wait and go to judgment, and we have to wait till the king gave an edict? But they didn't do that. They just went immediately, and they all ganged up and lynched this poor ant. And so therefore, you see that there is no king. Amar le Ravacha bered Rava Ravashe v'dilma malka hava behadaihu. Ravacha, son of Rava, whoever said to Ravashe, how did Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta know for sure that they have no king? Maybe the king was among them. The king also came out, and the king was right there, and he gave the edict on the spot. Oh, he was wrong. Look, he led us out into the sun. Kill him. Or maybe they already had a king's edict that said that they can kill it. Or maybe usually they have the king, but here it was between kings. One king died, and they were working on elections for the next king, so it was between. So then, they decided on their own, but maybe usually they have a king. him, and Melech B'Yisrael Ish Hayashar Be'enav Ya'aseh. This happens with humans too. And in the history during the time of the Shoftim, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everybody did whatever they wanted. It was anarchy. So sometimes in human civilizations also, usually there's a king, but sometimes there's no king. Ela semocha hemanuta di Shlomo. Rather, we should rely on the credibility of Shlomo. King Shlomo knew what he was talking about in Mishleh, that in fact ants do not have a king. Fascinating story. Amar Rav Huna, siman l'tirfa 12 chodesh. Rav Huna says that a sign that something is terefa is if it cannot live for 12 months, which means if you wait 12 months and it survives, then you could tell that it's kosher. Metibe, siman l'tirfa kol shena yoledet. We're going to challenge Rav Huna from a baraita. The baraita will have several different opinions, but none of them will match up with Rav Huna. Some shorter, some longer. And the first opinion in Baraita is, how do you know something's terefa? If it cannot give birth. If it's a female and it cannot give birth. That means it's a female, it has some injury, and it gives birth, then it's not a terefa, it's kosher. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer, meshabachat veholechet, beyadua shehi keshera. Mit na veholechet, beyadua shehi terefa. Rashbag says, if it gets better and better, a little better improvement every day, then it's kosher. If it gets worse and worse, then it's a terefa. Rabbi Omer, siman terefa sheloshim yom. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says 30 days, not 12 months. If it lives past 30 days, it's kosher. Amru lo v'halo harbe mitkayimot shetayim shalosh shanim. But the other said, wait, why are you saying 30 days? There's many animals that are definitely a terefa, but they can survive 2 or 3 years. You see, that opinion says 2 or 3 years. But none of the opinions here say 12 months. So they're all a challenge against Rav Huna. And the answer is Tana'ehi. There's machloket Tana'im. The Tanya. There's a lot of opinions here, but there's yet another opinion among the Tana'im that we find in the following Baraita. Ubegulgolet ad sheyesh ba nekeb ehad aroch afilu nekabim harbe mistarfim lemelo makdeach. We learned that if there's a hole in the skull of an animal that's the size of a drill hole, when they would do surgery and drill a hole, then it's a terefa. Now, if it's a long hole but long and thin, or it has many small holes, then you add up the surface area altogether, and if it adds up to the size of a drill hole, that's a terefa. Amar Rabbi Yosef ben Hameshulam, Maaseh be'inbul, behad she'nifhata gulgalto. And Rabbi Yosef ben Meshulam says there was a case in a place called Inbul regarding a person who had a hole in his head. He was missing a piece of his skull. Ve'asu lo hiduk shel keruya ve'haya. And they made a patch using the shell of a gourd, and they put it on him, and he survived. Amar lo Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, misham re'aya yemot hachama haya, vechevan she'avru alav yemot hasina miyad met. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says, you bring a proof from there that someone with a hole in his head, the same would be true, we assume, for an animal with a hole in its skull, is kosher and not a terefa. You can't bring a proof from there because that story happened in the summer. This guy from Inbul got a hole in his head in the summer, and they patched it up with the gourd. And so he lived for some time throughout the summer. But winter came, and he died. So you see, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, it's not sufficient if he lives just for a few days or for a month or for one season. He has to live through the summer and through the winter, meaning 1 year. And so Rav Huna can rely on Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, who says 1 year, even though there are other Tanaim that follow other timelines. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.